The first bell. The bell rang at 4:45 in the morning. It rang from a wooden tower set into the roofline of the mill, a 5-story brick building that ran along the south bank of the Merrimack River, and would have been farmland only a decade before. And before that, the territory of the Pennacook people who had fished the same falls for centuries. The bell was not ceremonial. It had no grandeur to it, no slow bronze resonance of a church bell calling the faithful to a sacred hour. It was a working bell, purposeful and exact, and its message was the same every morning of every week except Sunday. It is time now, and you are needed, and the gate will close without you. In the winter months, and in the autumn, and the spring, and much of what passed the summer in eastern Massachusetts, the bell rang into darkness. The town of Lowell had been incorporated in 1826, less than a decade before the moment we are arriving in, and in the mid-1830s, it still had the quality of a place that was constructing itself as you watched. The mill buildings themselves rising solid and permanent along the canals, red brick in 5 stories, and as confident in their permanence as anything human beings had yet built in America, while the streets around them remained half-finished, rutted with wagon tracks, lined with rows of identical boarding houses built to house the workers who kept the looms running. On a November morning, before any light appeared in the sky, you would have heard the river before you saw anything else. The low, continuous roar of the Merrimack coming over the Pawtucket Falls, a sound that had been here long before the mills, and that would continue long after, indifferent to all of it. Eliza Hartwell had arrived in Lowell in the first week of November, 1834, on a wagon that came down from the hills of western New Hampshire. She was 17 years old. Her family farmed a small and rocky plot in a county where farming had never been easy, and it was becoming harder every decade as the soil gave back less than it was asked for, as the prices a farm family could expect for their surplus grain and potatoes continued to slide slowly downward in ways that no individual family had much power to address or explain. Her father carried a debt to a man in town, a debt that had grown modestly but persistently over the years the way such debts do, and her 2 younger brothers would need whatever farm could offer for many years yet. Eliza was 17 and old enough to work and young enough to be unmarried, and a neighbor woman had told her mother that a girl could earn something close to $2 a week in the Lowell Mills after the cost of board was taken from her wages. That would leave somewhere between 50 cents and $1 a week, depending on the overtime and the season, and over the course of a year of careful saving. That was enough to make a genuine difference in the arithmetic of a household that needed every small difference it could find. This was a story many young women told themselves on a wagon ride south from the hill country. Not that they wanted to work in a factory, exactly, but that working in a factory was the road towards something else. Some were sending money home. Some were saving for a dowry. A smaller number, and these women appeared in memoirs and letters that survived from the period, thoughtful in particular, were saving toward a term in an academy, toward books, toward some notion of a future that the farm had no room for, and that no one around them had quite sanctioned either. Whatever the individual reason, the wagon road south to Lowell carried a steady traffic of young women from the farms of New Hampshire and Vermont and the hill towns of western Massachusetts, and the mills absorbed them and put them to work. The company had taken some care with the presentation of this arrangement. There was company literature, pamphlets, really, distributed through the networks that reach rural families, describing the Lowell Mills as something meaningfully different from the factories that reformers in England were already writing about with alarm. The boarding houses, these materials emphasized, were run by respectable women of good character who attended to the moral welfare of their charges. The work was clean and indoor and supervised. The girls who came to Lowell would not be degraded by the experience. They would be improved by it, earning honest wages in a well-ordered environment before returning home, in most cases, to marry and settle. The company was offering, in other words, not just employment, but a kind of guarantee, a social contract in which the factory's rules were the price of admission to a protected and morally certified life. Eliza had not read any of this literature herself. She had heard pieces of it secondhand, the way most information traveled in the 1830s, passed from person to person, and reshaped a little with each retelling, softened in some places and sharpened in others. What she understood when she arrived was roughly this. The mills were orderly and the workers were supervised. The hours were long, but the work was indoors, and the rules that governed the place were strict but fair, or at any rate no stricter or less fair than the rules that governed any decent household. She arrived on a Thursday, which gave her 2 days to find her footing before the full week's work began. The boarding house where she was placed, and place is the right word, since new workers were assigned by the company to specific houses in proximity to the specific mill where they were to work, was a narrow 3-story building on a street called Corporation Row, one of a long terrace of nearly identical structures that the company had built, owned, and maintained for exactly this purpose. The woman who ran it, a widow in her late 40s named Mrs. Farwell, met Eliza at the door with an expression that conveyed no particular hostility, but that communicated with great efficiency the extent to which individual variation was an inconvenience here. There were 16 other women already living in the house. Eliza would share a room with 3 of them. The meals were served at 6 in the morning, at noon, and at 6:30 in the evening. Workers were expected to be seated at the table promptly or to go without. The front door was locked at 10 o'clock each night. Church on Sundays was not a suggestion. Mrs. Farwell also explained, while Eliza's single trunk was being carried upstairs by the woman she would later learn was named Mercy, that the house rules were not the only rules that applied to residents here. The boarding house operated under an agreement with the company, and the company expected Mrs. Farwell to report to the mill's agent any behavior among her residents that fell outside the bounds of propriety. Any late returns, any suspicious visitors, any evidence of habits that a respectable woman ought not to have. The arrangement was presented matter-of-factly, as something any sensible person would understand. The company had a legitimate interest in the conduct of its employees at all hours, not only the hours they spent inside the mill. Eliza had no particular response to this. She noted it, the way you note the weather when you arrive somewhere new, as a feature of the place rather than a judgment on it. She was tired from the wagon journey. She was given a small supper and shown to her room, and introduced to her 3 roommates, who were courteous but not effusive, having been through enough of these introductions to know that the new girl was still absorbing too much to absorb them properly yet. She woke on her first working morning to the bell, which she had been warned about, but which was still, in that first instant, something of a shock, the sound cutting through the dark and the warmth of the shared bed with a cheerful ruthlessness that left no room for the in-between state of early morning. Around her the other women were already moving, dressing quickly in the dark, pulling on stockings and stays and work dresses that were arranged for exactly this kind of rapid deployment. By the time Eliza gathered herself, Mercy was at the door saying, quietly but with the inflection of someone who has been late to the gate once and does not intend to be late again, that they needed to leave now. The walk along the canal path took perhaps 8 minutes. It was the kind of cold that settles in overnight and has not yet decided whether to lift. The air perfectly still and tasting faintly of the river. Other women were walking the same path ahead of them and behind them, their breaths showing as small clouds in the lamplight, their footsteps irregular on the frost-stiffened ground. No one spoke much. The canal lay dark and flat beside the path, and above it the sky was that shade of dark blue that comes in the last half hour before dawn. Not black, but not promising anything yet. Mercy walked fast and talked in a low voice and said things that Eliza tried to hold on to. You get used to the noise faster than you think, but the lint takes longer. It gets into everything. The overseer on their floor was named Mr. Simmons, and he was not unkind if you did what you were supposed to do and did not draw his attention. If you needed to leave the floor for any reason, you needed his permission, and he might say no, so you arranged yourself accordingly. The windows were nailed shut most of the year to keep the humidity in the room, because the thread broke in dry air. In summer, the rooms were very hot. You were not supposed to speak to other workers in a way that interfered with production, which in practice meant that conversation happened in glances and in the brief intervals when the machinery changed its rhythm, and you could be heard over it. The mill building came into view ahead of them as a mass of deeper darkness against a lightening sky, the long rows of windows throwing a yellowish oil lamp glow out onto canal. Even from outside, from 30 yards and closing, you could hear it. Not a single sound, but a composite of sounds. Hundreds of spindles turning and hundreds of looms throwing their shuttles in a dense, continuous mechanical presence that was not quite like anything Eliza had heard before. It was the sound of a great deal of organized force applied to a single purpose, and it was going to be the ambient fact of her waking life for as long as she remained here. A man with a watch stood beside the gate. He did not speak. He noted the time as each worker passed through, and the gate was closed. as it was every morning at 5 past 5, and anyone who had not passed through it by then would be turned away and docked. She followed Mercy across the mill yard and through a heavy door and up 2 flights of stairs to the weaving room, and she stood for a moment at the threshold and looked at it. The room was long, much longer than any room she had been in before, and crowded end to end with looms that were already in motion, tended by women who moved between them with a practiced, semi-automatic attentiveness, their eyes tracking the thread and the shuttle in the same way that a person monitors something that must not go wrong without requiring thought for each individual moment. The air in the room was warm and close, not the warmth of a hearth, but the warmth of machinery and many bodies, and the steam that some overseers introduced in cool months to protect the thread. It smelled of machine oil and raw cotton, and beneath both of those, something drier and more pervasive that Eliza could not immediately identify, a fine white dust that moved to the lamplight in slow drifts as though it were weather, settling on the looms and on the floors and on the windowsills and on the shoulders and hair of the women who worked here. This was the lint. In the 1830s, no one in the mills or in the offices of the mill companies was making any formal acknowledgement of what that lint was doing to the people who breathed it every day for months and years. The understanding would come later, slowly, through doctors' testimony and workers' petitions and the kind of evidence that accumulates when enough people in a specific place develop a specific cough and never quite recover from it. For now, in the morning lamplight of the weaving room, the lint was simply there drifting. Just inside the door, tacked to the wooden frame at approximately eye level, was a printed sheet of paper. Eliza paused long enough to read it before Mercy took her arm and steered her toward the loom, where she would begin her training. The sheet bore the heading, Rules and Regulations to be observed by all persons employed in the weaving department of the Lowell Manufacturing Company. She read as much as she could in the time she had. The language was official and impersonal, and it covered more ground than she had expected. It specified that all workers were to labor diligently and faithfully during working hours, and that any worker who was absent without the prior permission of the overseer would have the lost time deducted from their wages. It specified that workers who left the company's employ without providing 2 weeks' notice in advance would be entered into the company's records as having left under unsatisfactory circumstances, which would be communicated to the agents of the other mills in Lowell, so that the worker would find herself unable to obtain employment elsewhere in the city. The mills kept these lists, kept them carefully, compared them with one another, treated them as a shared resource, and a girl whose name appeared on one of them had no practical recourse. It specified that any worker found intoxicated, or engaged in gambling, or behaving in a manner determined by the overseer or the company's agent to be immoral or disruptive, was subject to immediate discharge without the usual notice period. It specified the working hours, 5 in the morning until 7 in the evening, with 30 minutes allowed for breakfast and 30 minutes for the midday meal, giving a total of 13.5 hours of actual work each day on the standard schedule, with the possibility of additional hours during periods of high demand. It specified that workers were required to comply with all regulations of the boarding house in which they resided, since those regulations were considered an extension of the company's legitimate authority over the conduct of its employees. And near the bottom of the sheet, in smaller type, it specified that any worker who accepted and signed for her wages at the close of each week was understood to have signified her continued acceptance of all conditions listed herein, together with any alterations the company might see fit to make to those conditions going forward. Mercy touched her arm again, and she moved. What stays with you, if you try to put yourself into that weaving room on that November morning, is not any single rule on that posted sheet. Each one, read in isolation, could be explained, could be contextualized, could be compared favorably to conditions in less organized places. It is the whole of it. It is the fact that the rules did not stop at the factory gate, but followed the worker down the canal path and into the boarding house and up the stairs and into the shared bedroom. It is a fact that the rules covered not just the hours of work, but the hours of sleep, not just the body's labor, but the body's recreation and rest and religious practice and public speech. It is a fact that accepting your wages, which you needed, which was the entire point of being here, was written into the contract as your ongoing consent to whatever the company decided to put on that sheet next week or the week after. This was what it meant to live a life governed, hour by hour, by someone else's written rules. Not oppression at the level of the dramatic and the sudden, but something more like weather, present everywhere, varying in its intensity, and largely outside the control of any individual who needed to remain in it. Eliza turned to her loom, and the morning began, and the shuttle moved, and the bell that had woken her would ring twice more before the light outside the sealed windows changed to anything she could recognize as dusk. The house the company kept, the door of the boarding house on Corporation Row, was locked at 10 o'clock in the evening, and it was locked by Mrs. Farwell herself, who stood in the narrow entry hall with the key already in her hand at 5 minutes to the hour, in case anyone had ideas about the buffer time between the clock striking and the bolt going home. In all the months that Eliza lived in that house, she never saw anyone test the arrangement. Whether this was because the women respected the curfew or because they were too exhausted by the end of the 13-hour workday to have any ambition toward the evening at all is a question she later said she could not answer with certainty. On her first evening, she returned from the mill at 7:30 in the state she could only describe, years afterward, as emptied, not unhappy, exactly, not in pain, exactly, but thoroughly used up in a way that was different from the tiredness that came at the end of the day's farm work, which was a tiredness of muscle and outdoor cold. This was something more interior, something done to the attention rather than the body, though the body has complaints too. Her ears rang in the sudden quiet of the boarding house entry. Her feet ached from standing on wooden floors all day, and her fingers, which she had used all afternoon to tie off broken threads with a quick, practiced motion she was still learning to execute in time, were sore at the tips in a way she had not anticipated. Supper was already on the table when she came in. The meal was plain and substantial: salt fish, boiled potatoes, bread, and a weak tea that served mainly to be warm, and it was eaten fast because the women who were already seated had learned, over their months and years in the house, to eat with the same efficiency they brought to everything else. There was conversation, but it was low and abbreviated, the kind of talk that happens between people who are conserving something. After supper, the dishes were cleared by the younger residents on a rotating arrangement that Mrs. Farwell administered, and by 8:30, most of the women in the house had retreated upstairs. Eliza sat for a little while in the common room on the ground floor, which held a few chairs and a small table and a shelf of books that the company had provided. Religious texts, mostly, a bound volume of improving essays, a dog-eared almanac. The room was lit by a single oil lamp. Mercy was across from her, mending a stocking. Two other women were reading, or appearing to read, or holding books in front of their faces in the posture of people who have stopped following the words. By 9 o'clock, Eliza was upstairs herself, and by 9:30, in the shared warmth of the bed she occupied with the woman called Patience, who slept with the total absence of self-consciousness that belongs to people who have long since made their peace with the necessities of communal life. She was asleep. At 10 o'clock, the front door was locked. The boarding houses of Lowell were not incidental to the mill system. They were not a convenience that the company offered as a courtesy to workers who had traveled too far to commute. They were a structural feature of the entire enterprise, conceived from the beginning as the mechanism by which the company's authority over its workers extended beyond the factory walls into the hours of leisure and rest and personal life that in any other arrangement would have been the workers' own. The men who designed the Lowell system, and they were men, Boston merchants and investors who had studied the textile mills of England and resolved to build something that could not be accused of the same social degradation, had made a deliberate and explicit decision that the labor force they needed could be drawn from the farms of New England only if respectable farm families could be persuaded that their daughters would be safe. And the boarding house, carefully regulated and carefully run, was the answer to that persuasion. Each house along Corporation Row operated under a contract between the company and its keeper. The keeper, almost always a woman, almost always a widow who needed the income and the housing that the arrangement provided, received a small wage and occupied the ground floor room in exchange for managing the house according to the company's specifications. Those specifications were written down, as most things in Lowell's formal operations were written down, and they covered more ground than the average domestic arrangement. The keeper was responsible for ensuring that all residents were inside the house by 10 o'clock each evening. She was responsible for ensuring that no men entered the house except during the brief afternoon visiting hours on Sundays, and that those visits occurred in the common room only, never in the upstairs rooms. She was responsible for monitoring the behavior of her residents and for reporting to the mill's agent, the man who functioned as the company's administrative representative in the town, any conduct she deemed inconsistent with the company's standards of propriety. She was In a word, a surveillance system with a warm face and a key on her belt, and the mill companies of Lowell were entirely candid with themselves and with their agents about this being one of the central purposes of her position. Mrs. Farwell, in Eliza's experience, was neither cruel nor particularly warm. She was competent. She ran the house with the brisk efficiency of someone who had been doing the same job for long enough to have optimized every part of it. And she enforced the rules not with any evident relish, but with the matter-of-fact consistency of a person who has decided that rules either mean something or they mean nothing, and that she has chosen the former. If a woman came home late, and this happened rarely, but it happened, Mrs. Farwell noted the time and reported it to the mill agent, who had noted in his records. 2 such incidents in a worker's file constituted the kind of evidence that might contribute to a discharge. A discharge under those circumstances meant leaving with papers that marked you as unsatisfactory, and papers of that kind, shared among the agents of the various Lowell Mills, could make it very difficult to find employment in the city again. The rules of the boarding house were posted in the common room in the same plain language format as the mill regulations, which was either a coincidence of corporate style or a deliberate reminder that the 2 documents issued from the same source and carried the same weight. The house rules were: no residents to return after 10 in the evening, no improper company, the company's term, meaning male visitors except under authorized circumstances, no alcohol on the premises, no behavior that might disturb the quiet and order of the house, a clause capacious enough to cover almost anything a keeper chose to apply it to, no staying out overnight without the advance permission of the mill agent, which was given rarely and under specific circumstances only, and church on Sundays was expected, not explicitly commanded in the posted language of the house rules, since that might have raised constitutional questions that the company preferred not to invite, but expected in a way that many things in Lowell were expected. Through social pressure, through the keeper's example, through the company's evident interest in workers who were morally supervised and spiritually attended to, the company had, in fact, helped to build some of the churches in Lowell. This was consistent with the general philosophy of the enterprise. If a thing contributed to the orderly, sober, morally certified life of the workforce, the company had an interest in providing it. Churches contributed. Circulating libraries contributed. And the mills had established small libraries, accessible to workers for a few cents a month, stocked with improving literature of the kind that the company found unproblematic. Evening lecture series, organized by the mills or by civic associations that the mill company supported, were considered beneficial. The workers of Lowell were encouraged to improve themselves, to attend lectures on natural philosophy and history and literature, to read and to write, and participate in the cultural institutions of a small city that was, in some respects, genuinely more culturally active than one might expect from a town built primarily to produce cloth. There was, by the early 1840s, a literary magazine called the Lowell Offering, which published essays and poetry and fiction written entirely by mill workers, mill women, almost all of them, and which attracted attention both in New England and eventually in England, where visitors like Charles Dickens, arriving in Lowell in 1842 to assess the famous manufacturing experiment for himself, cited the magazine as evidence that American factory work need not be brutalizing. The existence of the Lowell Offering was real, and the women who wrote for it were genuinely talented and genuinely engaged with the literary culture of their moment, and the magazine itself was a remarkable thing. But it was also, from the beginning, a thing the company encouraged and was pleased to have exist because it served the same function as the churches and the libraries and the lecture series. It demonstrated that Lowell was not England, that the women of Lowell were not degraded factory hands, but improving young women who used their leisure productively and reflected well on the enterprise that employed them. What the Lowell Offering did not publish, until near the end of its run in the mid-1840s when conditions in the mills had worsened considerably, was material that criticized the mill companies. Not because the editors forbade it. The editors were themselves mill workers, but because the pressure was understood and because women who had already signed their wages away in exchange for their acceptance of the company's rules were aware, at some level, that the rules included unwritten clauses about how loudly you complained and in what forums. Eliza read the Lowell Offering. She found it genuinely interesting, a publication unlike anything available in the hill country of New Hampshire, and it was one of the things she would remember afterward with warmth, that in the evenings, after supper and dishes, in the common room with the single oil lamp, There was often something worth reading. She also attended the lectures when they were offered, sitting in drafty halls with 50 or 100 other women, while a man from Boston discoursed on astronomy or the history of ancient Rome. These were real pleasures, available to her in Lowell in a way they had not been at home, and she recorded them as such. What she also noticed, and what she recorded more carefully in later years when she had the distance to name it, was the way all of it was channeled. The leisure was as organized as the labor. The acceptable forms of self-improvement were understood, and the less acceptable ones were simply absent from the calendar. You could go to a lecture on astronomy. You could read the offering. You could attend a church that the company had helped to build and listen to sermons that tended to emphasize, in Eliza's summary, the Christian virtues of patience and diligence and gratitude for one station. What you could not do, what was absent from the list of approved activities, was attend a meeting organized by workers to discuss working conditions, or read a labor newspaper, or speak in a public way about the gap between the pamphlets the company distributed to farm families in New Hampshire and the reality of the life those families' daughters were arriving to find. The company, by the early 1830s, was already watching for exactly this kind of thing. There had been a turnout, the workers' word for a work stoppage, in Lowell in 1834. The same year Eliza arrived, a brief and unsuccessful action in which several hundred women walked out in protest of a wage reduction. It was put down quickly. The women who organized it were discharged. Their names entered into shared records of the mill agents, and most of them left Lowell for good. The turnout was not spoken of openly in the boarding houses afterward, but it was known. Eliza knew it, as she had known most things in her first weeks, second-hand and in pieces, from Mercy, from other women in the house, from the quality of the silence that fell when certain subjects came up at the supper table, and then, just as naturally, lifted when the subject moved on. None of this was a texture of her daily life most evenings. Most evenings, the boarding house on Corporation Row was simply the place where the day ended, warm, close-quartered, smelling of boiled food and with smoke, filled with the sounds of women moving to the narrow routines of an evening before another early morning. Beds were made with shared blankets. Hair was let down and brushed. Someone on the second floor was learning a piece of music on a small instrument and practiced in the same short fragments every night until gradually, over the course of a month, the fragments connected into something that could be recognized as a tune. On winter evenings, a single common room lamp was not quite sufficient for close reading, and women carried candles up to their rooms and read by them until the wax ran down or the cold defeated the candle's warmth, whichever came first. And on Sundays, which were the one day the mills were silent, the boarding house had a different quality entirely. Eliza woke on her first Sunday to church bells, not the mill bell, which she had already learned to recognize by its specific pitch and weight, but the church bells of several congregations ringing across the town in loose overlapping sequence, a softer kind of summons. The house was slower to wake on Sundays. There was no canal path to walk in the dark, no gate to reach before 5:05. Breakfast came at a more reasonable hour, and then the women of the house dressed in the better clothes that were kept for Sundays and went, in ones and twos and loose groups, to services. The church Eliza attended through most of her time in Lowell was a congregational church 3 streets from the boarding house. The services were long and the pews were hard, and the minister had a manner that suggested he was addressing slightly more people than were actually present. But Eliza was not hostile to religion and found the services tolerable, and in any case the social pressure of the boarding house arrangement made attendance the simpler choice. What she noticed, over many Sundays, was that the other women in the pews, women she recognized on the mill floor and the boarding house table, women whose names and stories she was slowly accumulating, carried themselves differently here than they did during the working week. Not the posture of relief, exactly. More like the posture of people remembering that they had a self outside the mill, a face that was theirs before it was a company's. An hour on a Sunday in a church pew was not freedom, was not leisure in any full sense of the word. But it was time spent not standing beside a loom, and after 6 days of standing beside a loom, that distinction felt like something. The bell at the church was nothing like the mill bell. It was slower and it lasted longer, and when it rang on Sunday mornings over the rooftops of Lowell, over the boarding houses and the counting houses and the canals where the water ran the same color as the November sky, it sounded, if you were not listening for anything in particular, almost peaceful. By the time the services ended and the congregation filed out into the cold air of Sunday afternoon, the bell at the mill was quiet, and the looms were still, and the whole canal-fretted town lay in particular Sunday stillness of a place that would begin again tomorrow, and could not help but begin again tomorrow, but that had been given by convention or religion or simple human necessity, this one day in 7 to be something other than a machine. It was, Eliza thought, a kind of pause. She would take it. The floor, the lint, and the clock. Between the first bell of the morning and the last bell of the evening, there were 11 bells in total. Not every bell meant the same thing. The bell at 4:45 meant wake. The bell at 5 meant walk. The bell at 5:05 meant the gate was closing. The bell at 7 in the morning meant that the looms, which had been running since 5, had been running for 2 hours and would run for another 3 before anything else changed. The bell at 7:30 meant that the breakfast break was beginning, that workers had exactly 30 minutes to leave the mill floor, walk to the boarding house, eat whatever was on the table, and return before the bell rang again at 8 o'clock, and the overseer noted who was back at their station and who was not. The bells continued through the day like this, each one marking a boundary, a transition, a moment at which something was permitted or required or forbidden, until the final bell of the evening at 7 o'clock signaled that the looms could stop and the workers could put down whatever they were doing and file out through the yard and into the evening, which by November had been dark for 2 hours already. Eliza had grown up with rhythms imposed by light and season and the slow biology of livestock and crops. Those rhythms were demanding in their own way, often relentless, but they had a quality of responsiveness to them. They bent slightly under unusual circumstances. They acknowledged bad weather. They allowed a sick person to rest. The rhythms of the mill floor bent for nothing. They proceeded on their schedule, whether you were well or unwell, whether the morning was bright or dark, whether you had slept soundly or lain awake for reasons a bell at 4:45 had no interest in. The machinery ran at the speed the overseer set, and the bells rang when the clock said they should, and the clock did not consult the people underneath it. She understood this in theory from her first day. She understood it in her body somewhat later, in the way the body comes to understand things that the mind has already accepted, slowly, through accumulated sensation and repetition, until one morning she woke to the first bell and realized she had been living by its schedule long enough that it no longer felt like someone else's schedule, but simply like the shape of time. The weaving room on the 3rd floor of the mill was a world with its own interior geography, its own hierarchies, its own spoken and unspoken laws, all of which existed in addition to the printed regulations on the wall beside the door. The printed rules were the official map. The actual terrain was something you learned by walking it, and it took most workers the better part of a month to feel that they had a reliable sense of where everything was. The room held approximately 90 looms arranged in rows, each loom perhaps 4 feet wide and operated by a worker who stood beside it, or more often between it and the one adjacent, since most workers by the mid-1830s were responsible for tending 2 looms simultaneously rather than 1. The 2-loom system had been introduced some years earlier as a measure of economic efficiency. The same worker managing twice the machinery meant the same labor cost spread across twice the output, and it was presented in company accounting as an innovation, which in the sense that it increased production, it genuinely was. What it meant on the floor in practice was that a worker who had spent months becoming proficient with one loom now had to develop a second attention, a way of monitoring 2 mechanical systems at once with the peripheral awareness of someone who has learned to watch 2 things without looking directly at either. The primary task of the weaving room worker was to keep the threads from breaking, and when they broke, to repair them fast enough that the cloth came out without visible defects. Warp threads broke when the tension was wrong or the humidity dropped. Weft threads, carried through the warp on the shuttle, broke when they ran out or when the shuttle hit an irregularity. When a thread broke, the loom did not stop. It continued throwing the shuttle through the gap, producing a fault in the cloth that would show up at inspection and could result in a deduction from the weaver's piece rate, because most workers were paid not purely by the hour, but by the amount of acceptable cloth their looms produced. The thread had to be tied off with a knot small enough not to show and fast enough not to affect production. This was a skill that took weeks to develop. The knot tied by feel at speed while the machine continued to run around the worker's hands. Eliza's fingers learned the knot before she could have explained how to tie it. Mercy watched her for the first few days and corrected her when the knot was too large or the repair had taken too long. And by the end of the second week, her hands were doing something that her conscious attention was no longer required to supervise. This was the ordinary miracle of factory work in the 19th century. The body became capable of things the mind had not consciously arranged. The skills settling into the muscles and the tendons in ways that freed the conscious attention to drift, sometimes toward other things, though there was never very far for it to drift on the mill floor. The rules about behavior during working hours were specific, and they were enforced. Workers were not to engage in conversation with one another during working hours in a manner that interfered with production, which was, in the interpretation of most overseers, a manner that involved any conversation at all above the level of a brief functional exchange. This was posted explicitly on the regulations sheet and was also enforced by custom and by the geography of the room, in which the noise of the machinery was dense enough to make sustained conversation difficult in any case, requiring a raised voice that drew the overseer's attention in ways that the speaker generally preferred not to have drawn. Women who worked near each other developed a vocabulary of gesture and glance, and a particular expression that communicates precise meaning, without requiring any of the features of language that a posted rule could prohibit. Workers were not to leave the mill floor during working hours without the express permission of the overseer. The overseer, on Eliza's floor, this was a man named Simmons, who was somewhere in his 40s and who had the specific combination qualities that the position seemed to require. Not cruel, not careless, but alert to every variance in the expected pattern with the attentiveness of someone who had learned to read a large room the way another person might read a text, could grant permission or deny it, and the grounds for denial were at his discretion. Women who needed to step outside the floor for basic physical necessities learned to plan accordingly, to manage the body's demands within the long stretches between bells, because asking Simmons twice in one morning for permission to leave was the kind of thing that was noted. Workers were not to damage company property. Workers were not to remove company property from the premises. Workers were not to affix anything to the walls of the mill beyond what was placed there by the company. Workers were not to introduce unauthorized materials into the mill. This clause existed because a woman who brought a book or a piece of needlework or any other non-work occupation to the mill floor was a woman whose attention was divided from her looms, which meant cloth produced at a suboptimal rate, and the possibility of faults in the weave. Workers who arrived at their station after the bell marking the start of a work period were docked not just the wages for the minutes they had missed, but, in some interpretations of the rules, an additional quarter hour beyond the actual time of the absence. A standard practice that was presented in company documentation as a measure to encourage punctuality, but that functioned in economic terms as a fine layered on top of the lost wages. A worker who was late often enough accumulated these deductions in a way that could meaningfully reduce the net pay she received at the week's end, which was the end of a week in which she had already worked 90-plus hours. Workers were not to discuss wages with other workers. This clause appeared in various forms across the mill companies of Lowell, and indeed across the factory culture of the period, and it occupied an interesting position in the architecture of the regulatory system, because it was both one of the most practical rules from the company's perspective. Workers who knew each other's wages were workers who could organize complaints about disparities, and one of the most difficult to enforce directly, since the kinds of conversations that produce wage. Knowledge happened in the spaces between monitoring, in the 30-minute breakfast break, in the 10-feet canal path between two women walking at the same pace, in the darkened common room after supper. The rule could not be enforced at the level of the weaving room floor. It could only be enforced at the level of what a worker chose to say if she were asked directly and knew she was being heard. The windows of the weaving room were nailed shut from October through April. In May they were opened briefly, and then through June and July and August and September they were open a little more, though never fully, and there was always debate between the needs of the thread, which required humidity and would break in dry air, increasing faults and decreasing the workers' piece rate pay, and the needs of the workers who required air that was breathable and a temperature that was not, as workers would testify before the Massachusetts legislature in later years. Somewhere between 100 and 110 degrees Fahrenheit in the summer months, when the looms and the bodies and the summer itself were all generating heat in a room with no adequate ventilation. In November, with the windows sealed, the air of the weaving room was warm and damp and carried the lint in slow suspension. The lint settled on every surface with patient democracy, on the machine housings, on the window glass, on the shoulders of the women working the floor, and in the air that those women breathed for 13 hours a day. It was white or grayish white, fine as dust, and it was simply present. The way the noise was present, the way the smell of machine oil was present. I conditioned the room that was so constant it gradually stopped registering as a separate phenomenon and became simply part of what the weaving room was. What it was doing to the lungs of the workers was not formally acknowledged by the companies in this period. There were physicians in Lowell. The companies employed some of them, and there was a general awareness among anyone who had spent time around textile factories that workers who had been on the floor for years developed respiratory conditions that workers who had not been there did not have. The mill cough, it was sometimes called, without elaboration. The condition was not named in any medical literature of the era with the specificity it would eventually acquire, and the companies had no regulatory obligation to address it, and so it was addressed in the way that expensive problems without regulatory solutions are generally addressed in environments where the cost of addressing them falls on the business. It was not addressed. Eliza felt a lint in her throat within the first week, a faint persistent irritation that she initially attributed to the dry cold of November air, and then, as November ended, and the heating in the boarding house warmed, and the irritation remained, understood was something the mill floor had given her, and that the mill floor would continue to give her as long as she worked there. It did not disable her. Most of the women around her had the same thing in milder or more advanced versions depending on how long they'd been there, and they worked through it with the same practicality they brought to every other feature of the floor. You coughed when you had to. You moved on. The noon bell, which rang at 12, initiated the most compressed and physically demanding 30 minutes of the day. When the bell rang, the loom stopped in the sudden relative quiet, the machinery slowing and halting in a sequence that produced a diminishing clatter before silence, a silence that felt very large in the space where the sound had been. 90 women began to move toward the stairs with a collective urgency that had nothing performative about it. 30 minutes was the time allotted for the midday meal. The boarding house, in Eliza's case, was an 8-minute walk from the mill. To eat and return in time required leaving the building within the first minute or two of the bell, walking fast, arriving at the table where Mrs. Farwell had already set out the food, eating without lingering over anything, and walking back in time to be at the station before the 12:30 bell completed its first stroke. Women who lived closer managed this more comfortably. Women who had been assigned to boarding houses at the farther edge of the corporation's housing often had barely time enough to eat before turning around again, and some of them, particularly in bad weather when the canal path was icy and the wind came straight off the river, did not bother attempting the trip and ate instead from whatever they had thought to bring from the boarding house that morning and carried in an apron pocket. The company did not provide a space in the mill for workers to eat during the break. The break was for the boarding house, and the boarding house was for the break, and the 30 minutes was, on paper, exactly sufficient for what it needed to contain. In practice, the noon half hour was one of the few periods in the working day when something loosened slightly. The walk to the boarding house was not monitored in the way the mill floor was monitored. Women walked in pairs and small groups, and they actually talked, in the full acoustic sense of the word, voices carrying across the canal path with an ease that had been impossible for the previous 7 hours. The talk was various. Practical things about the work, domestic arrangements in the boarding house, news from home arrived in letters, the details of people's lives that had no place on the floor but that needed to go somewhere. Mercy had a younger sister who was being courted by a man the family was uncertain about, and she discussed this on the noon walk with the seriousness it deserved, in installments across many days. Eliza had a letter from her father that arrived in her third week, a brief letter in his labored hand saying that the debt was somewhat reduced and that her mother's health was variable and that the younger boys were well, and she read it on the walk back from the noon meal and found that she was glad to have it, that it was real in a way that the mill floor was not quite real, even though she stood on the mill floor for 13 hours a day. The speed of the looms through the 1830s and into the 1840s was not fixed. It was variable, and the direction of variance was always the same. The machinery of the Lowell Mills ran on water power delivered through a system of canals and turbines from the falls of the Merrimack. The power was reliable and consistent, but the rate at which it was applied to machinery was adjustable, and the machinery could be driven faster if the company chose to drive it faster. Driving it faster meant more cloth produced per hour per loom, which meant more output for the same fixed cost of rent and equipment and water rights, which was straightforwardly better for the company's balance sheet. The cost was borne on the mill floor. A loom running faster threw its shuttle more times per minute, which meant the warp thread was under more stress, which meant it broke more often, which meant the worker who tended that loom was repairing breaks more often, which meant that the pace of her movements through the working day increased to match the pace of the machine. What had taken a certain learned attentiveness at one speed required a more urgent attentiveness at a higher speed, and as management periodically adjusted that speed upward in increments small enough to seem unworthy of formal protest, but cumulative enough to produce a meaningfully different physical experience for the worker over a period of years, the floor became, slowly and without any single dramatic change, a harder place to spend 13 hours than it had been before. By the time Eliza had been at the mill for 6 months, she knew the difference between the speed in November and the speed in April. She could not have measured it in objective terms. She had no access to the technical specifications of the machinery's adjustment, but her body registered it as clearly as it registered the difference between morning cold and afternoon warmth. She moved more, repaired more, attended more precisely, and with less margin for anything other than work, and by the end of the spring she was more tired at the 7 o'clock bell than she had been in November, though in November she had thought she was as tired as a person could be. She did not complain about this. The mechanisms for complaint were limited, and the consequences of being identified as a complainer were documented in the records that the mill agents maintained and shared. She noted the change in her body, stored it with the other things she was storing, and kept her hands moving. By the 4:30 bell in November, the light outside the sealed windows had gone entirely. The oil lamps on the mill floor had been supplemented by this hour with additional lighting on the frames and machinery, and the weaving room existed in its own self-contained illuminated world, completely detached from the sky outside. If it had been snowing all afternoon, the workers would not know. If the sun had come out after 3 days of clouds, they would not know. If the river was frozen or flooding, if a fire had broken out somewhere in town, if anything at all had happened in the world outside the mill walls between 5 in the morning and 7 in the evening, the workers of the weaving room would not know until the last bell released them and they came out into whatever the world had been doing without them. This was perhaps the most thorough effect of the regulatory environment of the factory floor. Not any single rule, not the fines or the gating or the overseer's permission slips, but the way the whole of it, the bells and the rules and the sealed windows and the sealed hours and the machinery running at its set speed, produce a person who had been, for 13 hours out of every 24, completely absorbed into a system that had no interest in anything she contained except her hands and her attention. At 7 o'clock the final bell rang. The loom stopped. In the silence, the women on the floor gathered their things. Shawls retrieved from the hooks by the door, small parcels, the practical odds and ends of a long working day, and moved toward the stairs in particular quiet of people whose bodies have been working very hard for a very long time and who are now doing the one thing they most needed to do, which is to stop. The sound of footsteps on the wooden stairs descending was soft and unhurried. The sound of people returning to themselves by degrees, floor by floor, until the cold air of the mill yard received them and they were outside, and the night was whatever the night was, and the boarding house was 8 minutes away, and supper was on the table, and the bell would ring again at 4:45, and tomorrow would be the same. But tonight it was quiet, and the looms were still, and that was its own kind of mercy. The company's store. The wages came at the end of the month, not the end of the week, which was itself a feature of the arrangement that Eliza had not fully absorbed when she first arrived. She had known that she would earn approximately $2 a week, and she had done the arithmetic on that figure during the wagon ride from New Hampshire, and she had arrived with a reasonable sense of what a month's labor would yield. What she had not done, because no one had walked her through it in specific terms, was the arithmetic of deduction. The mill paid in cash, which was in some respect a genuine point of pride for the Lowell companies. There were manufacturing operations elsewhere in America, and far more extensively in the coal mines and iron works of Pennsylvania and the mill villages of South, where cash was not the medium of exchange at all, where workers were paid in credit at a company store, or in printed tokens that had no value outside the company's own commercial system, or in a combination of cash and company-issued scrip that effectively tied the workers' purchasing power to whatever the company chose to sell them and at whatever price the company chose to charge. Lowell was not that. Lowell's wages were payable in genuine United States currency, and this was advertised to workers and their families as evidence of the company's good faith. And it was true, as far as it went. What also happened on the pay table in the mill agent's office at the end of each month was that a column of deductions appeared beside the column of gross earnings, and the figure that passed from the agent's hand into the worker's hand was what remained after those deductions had been subtracted. The first deduction was board, $1.25 per week, payable to the company that owned the boarding house, deducted at source so that the transaction between the worker and the company she lived would never actually require her participation. The board was not optional. Workers in Lowell who were assigned to company boarding houses, and almost all were, could not decline to pay for housing they had not chosen in order to live elsewhere more cheaply. The boarding house and the mill were a single system, and the wage and the rent were settled against each other before the worker had any say in either. For a worker earning $2 a week, the deduction of $1.25 per week left 75 cents. Over a 4-week month, that was $3 of gross earnings applied to board, and $3 remaining. If nothing else had been deducted, but other things were deducted, the company maintained a doctor on retainer whose services were available to mill workers, and the cost of this availability, not the cost of actual medical care, which was billed separately if it occurred, but the cost of the retainer, the right to access the doctor, was taken from wages as a standard deduction, an arrangement presented as a benefit of employment and experienced by most workers as a small tax on wages for a service they hoped not to need. In some mills, there was also a deduction for the oil used in the lamps that lit the mill floor during the long morning and evening hours of the winter season. The oil was a genuine operating cost of the company, and the logic of passing to workers rather than absorbing it as a business expense was a logic that governed most such decisions. The workers were there, the costs had to go somewhere, and the workers' wages were convenient somewhere. And then there were the fines. The fine schedule varied among the mill companies of Lowell, but in general terms it worked like this. A worker who was late to her station lost the wages for the time she had missed, plus a quarter-hour additional as a penalty for the lateness itself. A worker who accumulated a certain number of absences in a month could be fined on top of the day's lost wages. A worker whose cloth showed too many faults, too many broken threads improperly repaired, too many irregularities that showed up when the cloth was inspected off the loom could have the value of the defective cloth deducted from her piece rate pay, which was already calculated against the cost of the raw material she had been issued and the yardage she had produced. A worker who violated one of the conduct regulations in a manner the overseer chose to formalize rather than simply to note verbally could receive a written deduction against her pay record, and that deduction would appear in the subtraction column at the end of the month with the same impersonal authority as the board charge. Eliza opened her pay envelope on the afternoon of the 1st of December in the agent's office, with 12 other women from the weaving floor standing in a loose queue behind her. The figure on the paper was less than she had expected, and for a moment she simply looked at it, with the specific expression of someone recalculating while trying not to show that they are recalculating. The gross was $8.32. The deductions were $5.12. For weeks aboard at $1.25, the doctor's retainer, the oil, and a quarter-hour fine from a morning in her third week, when a knot had come loose on her secondary loom, and she had to leave her station briefly to locate Simmons and ask his permission to address it. And by the time she had returned to her station, the half-5 bell had already sounded, and she was counted late. $3.20 remained. She folded the paper and put it in her apron pocket, and moved away from the table to let the next woman step forward. And she spent the walk back to the boarding house working through the revised arithmetic. $3.20 per month was less than she had told her father to expect in the letter she had sent him before she arrived. Not dramatically less, but less. She would need to recalculate what she could send home and what she could save and how long it would take to put together the amount she had been holding in her head since the wagon ride, the amount that had a specific purpose attached to it, which she had not shared with anyone in Lowell, and which she thought about in the way you think about something that must not be disturbed by being discussed. What Eliza experienced at the agent's pay table in December of 1834 was a version of something that was experienced in more extreme forms by workers all across the industrial landscape of 19th century America. And in some of those landscapes, the gap between the nominal wage and the actual purchasing power of what a worker received at the end of a pay period was not a matter of a quarter or a half, but the entire sum. A gap so complete that some workers ended the month, not with a smaller amount than expected, but with nothing at all, or with a debt that had grown larger than the month before. The truck system, the practice of paying workers not in cash, but in credit redeemable only at stores or for goods controlled by the employer, existed in various forms across American industry throughout the 19th century, and its most complete and long-lasting expression was in the coal regions of Pennsylvania, in the iron towns of the Allegheny Range, and in the mill villages of the South, where the geography of isolation made what was elsewhere convenience into something closer to a necessity, or at least into something that could be presented as one. Picture a coal camp in western Pennsylvania in the 1840s or 1850s, a valley, a seam of coal running through a hillside, and a company that has purchased the land, sunk the shaft, hired the workers, built the houses, and opened a store, all in a location remote enough from any alternative that the store is not merely convenient, but essentially the only place within practical reach where a family can buy the things it needs to live. The company owns a store, and the store sets its own prices. And the prices it sets are not what they would be in a competitive market, because there is no competitive market here, because the nearest alternative is a day's travel away on roads that are the company's roads, and the company has no particular interest in making that journey easy. The company in such a place would pay its workers in what was variously called truck, scrip, or orders, printed certificates or tokens that were redeemable for goods at the company's store, and that could not be exchanged for cash anywhere the company did not sanction, which was everywhere the company found inconvenient. A worker who received his fortnight's wages in scrip and wished to use that scrip for anything other than company goods had two options: spend it at the store's prices, or attempt to exchange with a local merchant or neighbor at a discount, since scrip carried a market value below its face value because it was not real money, and everyone who might accept it knew it. The prices at the company's store were, as a general pattern, higher than prices at stores in nearby market towns that a worker could not easily reach. The standard markup varied by company and region, but the range of estimates that appear in legislative testimony and labor surveys from the period suggests something between 10 and 30% above what goods cost elsewhere. The company, when asked about this, would explain the markup as a function of the remoteness of the operation. The cost of transporting goods to the store in a valley that only the company's roads reached was genuinely higher than the cost of selling goods in a town already served by established trade routes. And this explanation was not entirely dishonest. But the explanation also had the quality of a logic that the company had arranged for its own convenience and was now citing as an objective constraint. The roads were remote because the company had chosen to mine coal in a remote valley. The store's prices were high because the roads were remote. The workers' real wages were what remained after the store's prices were paid. The company had made every decision in this chain, and the chain ended where it ended. The company also charged rent for the houses the workers lived in, deducted at source from scrip, and in some operations charged for the tools a miner required to do his work: the pick, the powder, the oil for his lamp. With those costs similarly deducted, a miner who worked a full fortnight and came to the pay window to collect his scrip might receive, after the deductions for rent and tools and store credit already drawn against the coming paycheck, a slip of paper that showed wages earned and a longer list of charges against those wages, and a figure at the bottom that was either very small or, in the worst cases, a fortnight when the coal seam had required extra powder, or a child had been sick and the company store's medicine had been necessary negative. A negative balance was a debt owed to the company, carried forward to the next pay period, where it would be deducted from whatever that period produced. Workers who ran a persistent deficit, not through improvidence necessarily, but through the ordinary expenses of raising children in a place where everything cost what the company decided it should cost, could find themselves in a condition that resembled indenture more than employment, bound to continue working at the same company in the same mine, not by any legal compulsion, but by a practical impossibility of leaving. A man who owed the company store $30 and earned, net of deductions, $2 a month was a man for whom leaving required either the willingness to walk away from a debt that would follow his name or the possession of $30 he did not have. This was the ledger as control. Not the dramatic control of a lock gate or a posted rule, but the quieter and in some ways more durable control of the balance sheet, which produced a condition in which staying was a rational decision and leaving was the irrational one, and which arranged that rationality without anyone having to enforce it directly. In Lowell, the system worked differently in its mechanisms but arrived at some similar destinations. There was no company scrip in the mill towns of New England. The wages were real money, and the workers could spend them where they chose. But the boarding house charges, deducted before the money reached the worker's hand, performed a similar function to the company store, dead in the sense that they reduced the real wage below the nominal wage by an amount the worker had not fully calculated in advance. And the practice that had the most binding effect on Lowell workers was not the financial system, but the reputational one. The blacklist, maintained collectively by the mill agents of the city, which meant that a worker who left a mill under circumstances the company deemed unsatisfactory found herself locked out not just of the mill she had left, but of all the mills in Lowell simultaneously. The blacklist was not called a blacklist by the companies. It was called a system of character records, and was presented as a service to the workers themselves, a way of documenting a worker's record of faithful service, so that she could, upon leaving one mill, present herself to another with a documented history of good standing. This framing was accurate, as far as it described what happened to workers whose records were clean. For workers whose records contained entries, a turnout, an unauthorized departure, a discharge or insubordination, or for the elastic category of improper conduct. The character record was not a service, but an instrument of exclusion, and the exclusion was comprehensive. Eliza knew women who had entries in their character records. There were 3 in her boarding house, each there for different reasons, and the presence of the entries shaped their relationship to their work in visible ways. They did not talk about leaving. They did not talk about disputes with Simmons, or about the wages they were receiving relative to what women who had arrived more recently were receiving, or about the conditions in the room. They had done or were believed to have done something that the company had found worth recording, and the record existed and would exist and would be consulted if they ever presented themselves at another mill agent's office in Lowell looking for a new placement. The record was not a sentence. It was not a wall. It was something more like a weight, carried invisibly, never acknowledged aloud, shaping the possibilities without eliminating them entirely. One of these women was named Clara, and she had been at the mill for 4 years, longer than almost anyone else in the boarding house, long enough to have a competence with the machinery that the overseer relied on, and that gave her a small and unofficial standing on the floor, the informal seniority that workers accumulate over time and that exists in any workplace beneath the official hierarchy. Clara had an entry in her record from 2 years earlier, arising from her participation in a meeting at which workers had discussed the recent increase in the machinery's speed and the question of whether there was a way to bring concern formally to the company's attention. The meeting had been informal and had produced nothing. No petition had been filed, no action taken. But someone had mentioned it to the mill agent, and the agent had made an entry, and Clara's name was now associated with the category of workers who required monitoring. She was good at her work, and she knew it, and Simmons knew it, and there was a kind of tacit negotiation between them that Eliza observed over many months without ever seeing it explicitly enacted. Simmons noted Clara's competence and gave her the slightly wider latitude that competence earns on any floor, and Clara performed her competence with the consistency of someone who understood exactly what she was spending and what she was getting in exchange. The entry in her record meant that she was not going anywhere, and both of them knew this, and the knowledge shaped their relationship in ways that neither would have articulated and that neither needed to. The economics of the mill system were not, from the company's perspective, primarily a system of control. They were a system of production efficiency, and the various financial mechanisms that tied workers to their mills were, in the accounting of the men who designed and ran these operations, simply rational arrangements. The boarding house recouped the company's investment in housing. The character records protected mill agents from workers who had proven unreliable elsewhere. The fine schedule discouraged the small inefficiencies that accumulated into larger production losses. Each element made sense within the logic of running a profitable manufacturing operation. Each element was also from the position of the worker receiving the end-of-month envelope with its column of deductions, a reduction in the space available for individual decision. The thing about financial control, as distinct from the more visible forms of control that existed in the posted rules and the lock gates and the overseer's permission slips, is that it works slowly and without drama. Eliza came to understand her financial situation in Lowell the way she had come to understand the machinery. Not all at once, not through a single illuminating moment, but through accumulated experience, through the end-of-month recalculation, through the revised arithmetic that became, over time, simply the arithmetic of her life here. By her third month, she had a clearer sense of what she was earning, and what she was keeping and what she could expect to send home, and the gap between what she had imagined on the wagon ride and what the ledger actually showed had closed, not because her wages had improved, but because her understanding of the system had. She adjusted. She economized in the small ways available to her. She bought very little from the shops on Market Street. May her clothing last, walked past the circulating library some weeks rather than pay the subscription fee. And she sent home what she could, which was not quite what she had promised, but was something, which was what she had to offer. In March, a woman at the boarding house on the corner of Corporation and Market left Lowell without serving her 2 weeks' notice. She had received a letter from home. No one in the boarding house heard its exact contents, but she had been very quiet for 2 days after it came. And on a Thursday morning she was gone, her trunk removed from the shared room, her place at the breakfast table empty. Her wages for the incomplete final 2 weeks were forfeit, absorbed back into the company's accounts as a standard penalty for unauthorized departure, and her name was added to the character records. Someone at the supper table that evening said she hoped the woman had gotten where she was going safely, and nobody disagreed, and nobody said anything further about it. And the meal continued, and Mrs. Farwell cleared the plates, and the oil lamp burned in the common room, and outside the window the March dark lay over Lowell, and the canal ran wherever canals run in the dark, without noise and without urgency, making its way in the only direction it was arranged to go, the smallest workers. There was a boy in the coal country of eastern Pennsylvania whose name, in the record that survives from a legislative investigation conducted in the early 1870s, is given only as Thomas, age 9, employed at the Eagle Colliery near Scranton as a breaker boy, occupation, picking slate. What a breaker boy did all day in that particular corner of the industrial world was this. He sat hunched over a moving chute through which broken coal traveled on its way to the sorting screen, and he picked out by hand the pieces of slate and rock and pyrite that had come up with the coal from the seam below, and that could not be allowed to travel on the market mix with the fuel. He picked with his bare fingers because gloves made it harder to feel the difference between coal and slate, and the difference was what he was paid to identify. And so he went without gloves, and his fingers bled in cold weather and were permanently blackened, and the skin at the tips hardened over months into something that no longer responded normally to heat or cold or pressure. He sat in a posture that was nearly doubled, hunched forward, neck bent, spine curved under a load that was not physical weight, but simply the sustained position to work. For 10 hours on most days, sometimes 12, in a room where the coal dust was as constant a presence as the lint was in Lowell's weaving rooms, and where the noise of the breaker machinery was not the dense mechanical sound of the looms, but something sharper and more grinding, the sound of coal and rock and iron, working against each other in continuous friction. He had been at the colliery since he was 7. Thomas is a composite, built from the testimony that investigators and reformers collected across the coal regions in the decades when the question of child labor was beginning, slowly and against considerable resistance, to become a subject of public record. His specifics, the Eagle Colliery, the age, the occupation, are representative of conditions that were documented by enough witnesses, in enough locations, over enough years, to constitute something beyond isolated exception. The breaker boys were a feature of the Pennsylvania coal industry, the way the weaving room was a feature of Lowell, not hidden, not particularly controversial within the industry. Simply the way things were arranged, a use of available labor that made economic sense to the people who had arranged it and that existed within a regulatory environment so sparse that it placed no meaningful constraints on the arrangement at all. This is a story of that absence of rules. Not rules like the ones posted on the wall of Eliza's weaving room, explicit, written, formally enforced, but the more fundamental kind of absence that exists when no one in a position of authority has yet decided that the people doing the work deserve to have rules written for their protection. in the coal mines and the glass furnaces and the cotton mills of the South and the canneries of the mid-Atlantic coast. The children who were working in spaces where the rules, if they existed at all, were written entirely by the people who employed them and served entirely the employer's interest. The question of what the children themselves needed from their working hours was not, in any formal sense, on the table. The use of child labor in American manufacturing was not, in the 19th century, a secret or a scandal in the way it would later come to be understood. It was a practice with respectable advocates, a documented economic logic, and a social framework that supported it with arguments drawn from both pragmatism and morality. Alexander Hamilton, in his report on manufacture submitted to Congress in 1791, a foundational document in the history of American economic policy, had described the employment of children in factories as an unambiguous social good, on the grounds that it made productive use of labor that would otherwise be idle, contributed to family income, and acclimated children to habits of industry that would serve them throughout their adult lives. This argument was not Hamilton's invention. It was a standard defense of child labor that had been developed in England over the preceding half-century, tested in the debates that accompanied England's own industrial expansion, and imported along with the machinery and the organizational practices that American industrialists were adapting from British models. The moral dimension of the argument was not trivial. Idleness, in the moral vocabulary of early 19th century America, was not merely unproductive but dangerous, a condition that exposed children to vice and to the habits of dependency that would make them poor citizens and poor Christians. Work, even hard work, even work that occupied 10 or 12 hours of a child's day, was understood by many respectable people to be preferable to the alternative, which was the street, the alehouse, the temptations available to children with unstructured time in the rapidly expanding cities of the industrial era. The factory was, in this framing, a disciplinary institution as much as an economic one. And the discipline it provided was something that the parents of poor children, unable to provide it themselves, might reasonably be grateful to have offered. The parents of poor children, it should be said, were often grateful, or at least were operating under conditions that made the distinction between gratitude and necessity difficult to maintain. A family in the mining districts of Pennsylvania or the mill villages of the South, whose children were employed, contributed measurably more to the household economy than a family whose children were not, and the margin between adequacy and insufficiency in those households was narrow enough that the children's wages were not supplementary income but structural. A family with 3 working children and 2 working parents was a different economic unit than a family with 2 working adults and 3 children who ate and needed clothing and had no income of their own. And the managers of mills and mines understood this perfectly and arranged their hiring accordingly. In the cotton mills of the American South, which expanded rapidly in the decades after the Civil War, and which drew their workforce from the white rural poor of the Piedmont, children worked alongside their parents not as an exception to the family arrangement, but as its basis. The mill village system of the South differed from the Lowell model in several respects, where Lowell had recruited individual young women who lived separately in company boarding houses. The southern mill villages recruited entire families who lived in company houses and sent every able-bodied member to work in the mill, including children as young as 6 or 7. The southern mills were not unaware of what they were doing, and some managers described the arrangement with paternalism so complete it had become entirely sincere. They were providing homes and work and community to families who had nothing, lifting them from the poverty of tenant farming into something more organized, more regular, more, the word that appeared most often in company documents and in the testimony of mill owners before early legislative investigations, more civilized. The mill village, in this telling, was an act of philanthropy administered to the mechanisms of commerce. For the children on the mill floor, the work was primary. They worked as doffers, a word that comes from the action of doffing or removing the full bobbins from the spinning frames and replacing them with empty ones, a task that required moving quickly through the frames on a cycle that the machinery's speed dictated, pulling a full bobbin, replacing it, moving to the next frame, and the next, in a continuous loop that demanded both a small child ability to reach into the low spaces of the spinning frame and a pace of movement that accommodated the machinery's rhythm rather than the child's. The doffing job was one of the few factory tasks for which a child's small size was explicitly an advantage, and mill managers were candid about this in their hiring. They wanted children for frames because children fit where adults could not reach without awkward contortion. Between the doffing cycles, when the frames were running and the bobbins were not yet full, the doffers had what was called a stretch of free time, which could be as short as 10 minutes or as long as an hour depending on the machinery's speed and the particular arrangement of the floor. In some mills, this time was not free in any meaningful sense, but was simply unstructured labor time in which the children were expected to sweep or carry or attend to whatever the overseer directed. In other mills, children ran in the aisles between the frames, played the improvised games of children who have a small defined space and very limited equipment, and talked to each other with the volume and chaos that children produce when the adult world is briefly occupied with something else. The overseer's response to this varied by individual and by mood, and the children learned the personal tolerance levels of each overseer with the accurate social intelligence that children develop when the people who supervise them are unpredictable. They were not paid at the same rate as adult workers. They were paid at a child's rate, typically somewhere between a quarter and a half of what an adult performing comparable tasks would earn, and this differential was presented as a reflection of the lower productivity of a child's labor, which was true in some tasks and not in others, but was consistently maintained as a matter of policy regardless. The child's wages went, in almost every case, directly to the family's account at the company store or to the father's pay envelope, not to the child. The child worked, and the child work translated into income that someone else managed, and the child's relationship to that income was indirect enough that most children in the southern mill villages would have had difficulty describing, if asked, what their labor was worth in dollars. In the glass houses of New Jersey and West Virginia and the Ohio River Valley, the work assigned to children had a specific physical character that the glass industry required, and that, unlike the doffing or the breaker work, involved genuine proximity to extreme heat. The glass furnace ran at temperatures that adult workers learned to manage through a combination of practice technique and constant vigilance, rotating away from the furnace at intervals to let the body's temperature recover before returning to the work. Children in the glass houses worked primarily as carrying boys or mold boys, carrying the finished pieces of hot glass from the blower station to the annealing oven, where the glass was cooled slowly to prevent it from cracking. The pieces were hot, not hot enough to damage a careful adult hand in the brief time the carry required, but hot enough that a child who lost his grip or stumbled would be burned, and children stumbled, and children were burned, with a regularity that characterizes any industrial process in which small people are moving quickly through hot environments carrying fragile hot objects. The glass house ran at night, at least in part, because the furnace's heat was better managed in the cooler temperatures after dark, and because nighttime operations extended the productive use of the furnace beyond the daytime hours without requiring the furnace to be relit. Boys who worked the night shift in the glass houses began their shifts at 5 or 6 in the evening and worked until 3 or 4 in the morning, sleeping during the day, eating at inverted hours, existing in a schedule that disconnected them from the rhythms of the world outside the factory in a way that was more complete than what most adult factory workers experienced. In the legislative testimony that began to accumulate on child labor in the 1870s and 1880s, the glass house boys appear repeatedly, described by investigators with particular quality of concern, not just for the heat and the hours, but for the inverted life, the childhood spent in furnace light and factory dark, while the regular world of daylight and school went on without them. The coal mines returned children to conditions that were, in their particular way, unlike anything else in the industrial landscape, underground or in the breaker buildings above the shaft, in an environment shaped by geology and by the specific requirements of extracting a mineral from the earth. The trappers were often the youngest workers in the mines, children of 5 or 6 or 7 who sat alone in the darkness of a mine passage beside a wooden door that regulated the ventilation of the tunnel. When a coal cart came through, the trapper pulled a rope to open the door and let the cart pass, then let the door fall close again. This was the whole of the job. It required no skill, no strength, and almost no movement. Simply sitting in the dark beside a door for hours, waiting for the rumble of the approaching cart, pulling the rope, letting the door fall, sitting again. The passages where the trappers sat were often too low for an adult to stand upright in, which was part of why children were assigned to them. The darkness was complete when a child's lamp burned out or was extinguished to save oil. The isolation was complete. A trapper might spend a 10-hour shift without speaking to another person, without seeing daylight, in a silence broken only by the distant sounds of the mine working deeper in a hill and the occasional rumble of the cart. That was his one task, and his only contact with the ongoing work around him. It is worth pausing on this image for a moment, because it resists the reduction economic analysis that most other features of child labor submit to. The breaker boys and the doffers and the carrion boys were, at minimum, in rooms with other people, moving, working at tasks that have variety of a kind, however limited. The trapper was alone in the dark. Whatever rules governed his workday, and the rules governing children in the Pennsylvania mines were, through most of the first half of the century, essentially non-existent. The absence of rules was, in this case, less significant than the absence of everything else. Warmth, sound, company, light. These were not the rules that the mine provided or failed to provide, because they were not the kinds of things that rules addressed. They were the kinds of things that only become visible as deprivations when someone has decided to look at the child rather than at the production ledger. That looking, when it came slowly and from several directions at once, and it came first not from the federal government, which would not involve itself in child labor regulation in any serious way until the early 20th century, but from reformers, investigators, and the legislatures of individual states, some of which had begun by the 1840s, to pass laws that addressed at least some of what was happening to children in factories. Massachusetts, whose textile industry was the most developed in the country, and whose political culture included a tradition of moral reform inherited from its Puritan history and updated to the abolitionist movement, had passed a law in 1842 limiting the working hours of children under 12 to no more than 10 hours per day. This was not a dramatic intervention. 10 hours per day was a reduction from what some children were working, but it was still 10 hours, and it still applied to children who were 8 and 9 and 10 years old. The law also had no enforcement mechanism of any substance, no inspectors empowered to enter mills and verify ages, no penalty strong enough to make non-compliance a serious business risk. Mill owners who wished to comply did. Mill owners who found compliance inconvenient found that the inconvenience was manageable, since the law asked nothing of them beyond the honor system. Other states follow with similar legislation, each one partial, each one weakly enforced, each one representing a recognition that something was wrong without yet having the institutional will to address the wrong directly. The recognition was genuine. The will was not yet sufficient. And between the recognition and the sufficient will lay decades of testimony and petition and investigation. The slow accumulation of evidence that is a usual precondition for reform in democratic societies, where nothing moves without first being seen clearly enough by enough people to become something that elected officials calculate is worth addressing. The people who began to see clearly in this period were a varied company. There were physicians who had documented the physical effect of factory work on children's developing bodies, the spinal curvature of the breaker boys, the lung conditions common to children in dusty factories, the injuries that occurred at rates that could be compared to injuries among adults in the same facilities. There were ministers who brought the vocabulary of sin and stewardship to what they observed in the mills and mines of their parishes. There were journalists who began, in the 1860s and 1870s, to publish accounts of what they had seen in factory visits that were sometimes granted by cooperative owners and sometimes conducted without the owner's awareness. And there were the workers themselves who had been speaking about conditions all along, but whose speech had been constrained by the same mechanisms that constrained it for adult workers: the character record, the blacklist, the dependence on continued employment. The children themselves are largely absent from this archive, because children's testimony was rarely sought and rarely preserved in the period before it became legally relevant. What we have are descriptions of children: the trapper in the dark passage, the doffer running between the frames, the breaker boy with blackened fingers, written by adults who were observing them, which is not the same as hearing from them, and the distance between the two is worth acknowledging. What the children thought about their working lives, what they understood about the arrangement, whether they conceive of it as unjust or simply as what life was, is a question the record does not answer with any confidence. What the record does preserve is that some of them were sick in ways their bodies announced without language, and that some of them were injured in ways the accident logs recorded in the neutral language of industrial accounting, and that some of them grew into adults who testified before legislative committees in later years about what their childhoods in the mills and mines had been, and that the testimony was specific and consistent in ways that suggest the experience it described was real, was remembered, and was worth putting into words. Eliza, in her boarding house on Corporation Row, was 17 when she arrived in Lowell, which made her nearly an adult by the standards of her time and entirely an adult by the standards of many of the children working elsewhere in the industrial landscape of the same decade. She had grown up to the Bell. They had grown up inside it. She had come to Mill by choice, or by the version of choice available to a girl with her options. Many of them had been sent or brought, or had simply accompanied parents who had no arrangement for them that didn't include the factory floor. She thought about the girls she had heard were working in the cotton mills of Georgia and the Carolinas. She had heard about them, not in detail, but in the way news traveled, in fragments and approximations. She had no particular frame for thinking about them that connected their experience to hers, because the connections were not the obvious kind. She was not a child. She was paid in cash. She was there for a defined purpose with a defined endpoint, some version of which she still held in mind as the reason she stayed. What she shared with the breaker boys and the trappers and the doffers and the carrion boys was something more fundamental than any of those differences. The fact that the work she did was governed entirely by the people who employed her, and that the question of what she needed, as a person rather than as a unit of production, was not the organizing question of any document she had signed or any rule she had read on any wall. That question was beginning, in the 1830s and 1840s, to be asked quietly, incrementally, in the chambers of state legislatures and in the columns of reform newspapers and in the depositions of physicians who had looked more closely than the mill owners wished they had. The asking was not yet very loud, but it had begun, and beginnings, however slow, are the only way things change. Outside the boarding house window, Lowell went about its evening. The canal ran dark and even. The mill buildings stood along the bank with their rows of lit windows, and inside those windows the second shift was running, and somewhere in the city a child who had come down from a New Hampshire farm with her mother and had been signing at the mill agent's office as 12 years old, though she was 10, was learning the shape of a working week that would occupy her for the next several years of what was, in any accounting that was not the company's, still her childhood. The candle on Eliza's windowsill burned down to its collar, and the room grew dim, and she did not light another. The long softening. Eliza left Lowell in the spring of 1837, on a morning in April when the ice on the Merrimack had broken and the river was running high and dark against its banks. She had been at the mill for 2.5 years. She left with the 2 weeks' notice properly served, her character record intact, her papers clean, and a sum of money in a cloth envelope that she had been adding to for 29 months with the specific, patient intentionality of someone who has held a purpose in mind long enough for it to become a kind of discipline. The amount was not large. It was enough to pay for a year's schooling at a small academy in the town nearest to her family's farm, and enough beyond that to cover her keep and books and the incidental costs of a year spent learning things that she had been telling herself, since the wagon ride south from New Hampshire, were worth whatever it cost to learn them. Whether the year would come to anything, whether the arithmetic of her family situation would allow her to build something further on it, she did not know and could not know, and she had decided that not knowing was a condition she could accept. She had spent 2.5 years inside an institution built on the premise that every variable could be controlled and every outcome specified in advance, and she had arrived at some appreciation for what it felt like to leave a thing open. She said goodbye to Mrs. Farwell, who shook her hand with the same efficient warmth she applied to everything, and to Mercy, who was staying, and to Clara, who was also staying, and who stood in the door of the boarding house as Eliza walked down the street with her trunk on a hired cart, and who raised one hand in a gesture that said something Eliza never afterward tried too hard to translate, because she thought the meaning was in the gesture itself, and not in any word she could put around it. The bell over the mill rang at 5 o'clock as she turned the corner at the end of Corporation Row. She was already late enough in the morning that the gate was long since closed, and the bell was a 4:30 mark for the second shift's morning hours, a routine measurement of an ordinary mid-April day in a city that had not noticed her arrival and would not notice her departure. She turned her face toward the road north, and the bell continued behind her, ringing its counted strokes over the rooftops and the canals and the spring-brown river, and then it stopped, and the mills ran on. What changed in Lowell, and in the American factory landscape more broadly, did not change quickly or cleanly. It changed the way a shore changes under a tide that is advancing in inches and retreating in inches and advancing again. so that standing on the beach at any given moment, you might not be certain which way the water was going. But returning after an absence of years, you could see that something had moved. The first organized expression of what the women on Lowell's mill floors were actually experiencing came in 1845, a decade after Liza's arrival, when a group of workers led by a woman named Sarah Bagley founded the Lowell Female Labor Reform Association. Sarah Bagley had been working in the mills since the early 1840s, and she was a person of striking energy and organizational clarity, someone who had come to the conclusion that the polite literary culture of the Lowell Offering, which had published her own writing, was not sufficient to address conditions that had, by the mid-40s, worsened considerably for what they had been in the early years of the system. The most immediate issue was hours. The working day in the Lowell Mills had not shortened since the 1830s. In some respects, as machinery speeds increased and the pressure for output grew, it had effectively lengthened, and the 10-hour movement, the campaign, spreading to the labor organizations of the industrializing world, to establish 10 hours as the standard and legal limit of a factory working day, had found adherents among Lowell's mill workers who were presenting petitions to the Massachusetts legislature asking for exactly this. The petitions were serious documents. They were signed by thousands of workers and presented to the legislature by Bagley and others who testified before the relevant committee about what the working day in the mills actually felt like and what it actually cost the body over years. The legislature listened, as legislatures do, and then it did what legislatures often do when they have listened and found the testimony credible, but the economic interests arrayed against action substantial. It recommended, without legislating, that the mills consider voluntarily adjusting their hours, and it appointed a committee to study the matter further. The mills did not voluntarily adjust their hours. The testimony, however, was entered into the public record, and the public record had a life of its own, and reformers who came to the issue in later years found in the accumulated petition testimony of the 1840s a foundation of documented evidence that they could build on. The first brick in the wall is not the wall, but it is where the wall begins, and Sarah Bagley, who left Lowell in 1847 when she was appointed postmistress in Lowell, the first woman in the United States to hold that position, a distinction that arrived with a particular irony of a reformed career redirected into a different channel at the moment it might have gone further, had laid more bricks than she was given credit for, at least in her own time. The 1850s and 1860s brought changes to Lowell's workforce that were not the changes the reformers had sought, but that altered the character of the system nonetheless. The young women from the farms of New England had been the original labor force of the mills, and they had always been, from the company's perspective, a somewhat complicated resource. Literate, opinionated, prone to writing petitions and founding organizations, aware of themselves as temporary residents of the mill system rather than permanent members of a permanent laboring class. As the system expanded to the 40s and conditions worsened, fewer farm families sent their daughters to Lowell, and the pipeline of young women from New Hampshire and Vermont and the hill towns of Massachusetts began to slow. The labor force that replaced them arrived from a different direction entirely. The Great Famine in Ireland in the second half of the 1840s had set in motion one of the largest and most rapid migrations of the 19th century, and a significant portion of that migration had come to New England, to Boston, and to the mill cities of the Merrimack Valley, where there was work for people who needed it urgently and were in no position to negotiate the terms. Irish immigrant workers came to the Lowell Mills without the social capital of the earlier mill girls, without families in the region, without the alternative of a farm to return to, without the cultural expectation that their time in the mills was temporary. They came because they had to, and because the mills would take them. The boarding house system, built for a specific kind of worker in a specific social arrangement, did not translate cleanly to a workforce that included whole families, that was not uniformly Protestant, that did not arrive with the expectation of improving lectures and circulating libraries. The company adapted pragmatically, as companies do, and some of the softer elements of the original Lowell system, the cultural institutions, the moral supervision, the careful presentation of the enterprise as something elevated above mere factory work, became less central to the operation as the workforce changed and the competition from other textile regions intensified and the pressure on costs increased accordingly. The lint was the same lint. The bell rang at the same time. The looms ran at the same speed or faster. The rules on the wall did not change in any substantive respect. But the context in which they operated had shifted, and the promise that had originally been attached to those rules, the promise of morally supervised, temporarily endured, ultimately beneficial arrangement, was no longer being made in the same way, because the people it had been made for were no longer the ones reading the rules. The machinery of reform moved on its own slow schedule, largely independent of these internal shifts in the mill's social composition. In 1869, Massachusetts established the Bureau of Statistics of Labor, the first institution of its kind in the United States, charged with gathering systematic data on working conditions, wages, hours, and living standards across the state's industrial workforce. The Bureau was not an enforcement agency. It could not shut down a mill or fine an employer or compel any change in the rules posted on a wall. What it could do was count and measure and publish. And in a political culture that required evidence before it could act, the systematic production of evidence was not a trivial contribution. The Bureau published its findings annually, in reports that combined statistical tables with narrative accounts gathered from workers and physicians and inspectors who had visited the facilities in question. The reports were read by legislators and reformers and journalists, and they accumulated over the years into a detailed documentary record of what industrial work in Massachusetts actually looked like, not the version in the company pamphlets, not the idealized labor of the Lowell offering, but the version registered in injury rates and infant mortality data, and the pulmonary diagnoses of mill workers who have been breathing lint for a decade. Other states developed similar institutions at different rates and with different levels of political commitment. And by the 1870s, the production of labor statistics had become sufficiently established that it was possible to speak with genuine empirical authority about working conditions in American industry in a way that had not been possible before. This sounds like a modest development, and in some ways it was. Counting the hours people work and recording the injuries that result are the most basic possible acts of institutional attention to the welfare of workers. That these acts were not performed systematically by any American government until the 1870s is itself a measure of how long the question of what workers needed had been subordinated to the question of what production required. The Massachusetts 10-hour law, when it finally came, arrived in 1874, 3 decades after Sarah Bagley and the Lowell Female Labor Reform Association had first petitioned for it. The law applied to women and children. It did not apply to adult male workers, whose hours remained a matter of contract rather than statute. It established 10 hours as the maximum legal working day for the covered workers, provided for inspectors empowered to visit mills and verify compliance, and set penalties for violations that were not spectacular but were real. The textile mills of Lowell did not close in protest. They did not relocate. They adjusted, as they had always adjusted, to the new constraint as they would have adjusted to a change in the price of raw cotton or a shift in the tariff schedule, pragmatically looking for a configuration that produced the most favorable outcome within the new boundary. Some mills increased piece rates to compensate workers for a shorter day. Others simply ran the machinery faster during the 10 hours available to produce the same output as 13 had produced before. The workers who had petitioned and testified and organized across 30 years for this change experienced it, in some accounts, as less than they had expected and more than they had dared to count on simultaneously. The 10 hours were genuinely 10 hours fewer lint-filled air per week than the 13-hour day had offered. That was real. The rest, the fines, the character records, the company towns and their extended surveillance, the truck system in the coal and iron regions, the children in the breaker houses. Those things were not addressed by a Massachusetts 10-hour law for women, and they continued, because the boundary of the law was narrow and the territory beyond was still largely ungoverned. Progress in this domain had the quality of a tide in the specific sense that it moved in both directions. A state that passed a child labor law in one decade might find its enforcement gutted in the next when the political balance shifted. A mill that voluntarily reduced hours when labor was scarce might restore them when immigration provided fresh workers willing to take whatever was offered. The gains that were made through legislation required the continuous political effort of keeping them made, and that effort was not always available, because the people whose working lives the legislation addressed were also the people whose working hours left them least time for politics. By the 1890s, Lowell had accumulated the visible signs of a city that has been through a long and not entirely gentle middle age. The brick mill buildings along the Merrimack were the same buildings they had always been, solid and enduring. but they wore now the patina of decades operation, and the streets around them had settled into the more irregular character of a city that had been built for one kind of workforce and was housing another kind, and that had begun the slow process of civic accumulation. Churches of different denominations, newspapers in different languages, the social institutions of communities that had not been anticipated in the original design of the corporation. The bell still rang. This is worth saying simply without elaboration. The bell still rang at 4:45 and at 5 and at 7:30 and at noon and through the afternoon to the final bell of the evening. And workers still walked the canal path in the dark and passed through the gate and stood beside their machines for the hours the law now specified and that the law's inspectors periodically verified. The rules on the wall were not so different in their categories from the rules that had been posted in the 1830s, though some of the specific penalties had shifted and the enforcement mechanisms had changed, and the worst excesses had been filed off by decades of litigation and legislation and public scrutiny. The fundamental structure had proved more durable than the worst of its individual features, that the employer wrote the rules and that the worker read them, and that the relationship between the two was governed principally by the employer's interest in production and only secondarily, and only insofar as external pressure required, by the worker's interest in a life that was livable. What had changed was the external pressure. It had grown slowly, unevenly, through the accumulated work of people like Sarah Bagley and the physicians who testified before state committees and the journalists who published what they had seen in the breaker houses and the Bureau of Statistics of Labor's patient annual counting. The pressure was not yet sufficient in the 1890s to have transformed the industrial workplace into something its workers had designed. It was sufficient to have moved some boundaries and to have created the expectation, shared now by enough people to have weight, that the boundaries could be moved further. That expectation was itself a change. It was not a small change in the accounting of people who had worked without it. The city of Lowell at dusk in the late 1890s had a particular quality of accumulated time. The evening light came in low across the Merrimack, golden and unhurried in autumn, catching the surface of the canal water and the faces of the brick buildings along its banks and the long rows of mill windows with the last of the day's sun before the evening shift lit them from within with the oil lamp glow that had always been the signature of the working hours. The river ran as it had always run, over the same falls of Pawtucket, with the same indifference to human arrangement, the same low continuous sound that preceded the mills by centuries and would succeed them by as many more. People walked the canal path in the evenings, after the day's shift ended and before the night closed fully in. Some of them were workers heading home. Some were the children of workers, brought up to know this path as a feature of ordinary life, as ordinary as a road through any other kind of town. Some were older people who had worked these mills for decades, whose bodies had registered the years on the floor in the ways that bodies register the places where they have spent their time. If you had stood on the canal path on an evening like this and listened, you have heard the river and the distant sound of the mills still running and the footsteps of people walking in the dusk, and high overhead, the bell marking the 6 o'clock hour from the tower of the old mill building that had stood on this bank since before most of the people on the path were born. The bell was the same bell, or a bell in the same place, or a bell whose purpose was unchanged even if the metal that made the sound had been replaced over the decades. It rang 6 strokes, and then it was done, and the echo of it moved over the canal and the river and the rooftops of the city, and then faded into the ordinary sound of an evening in October, which was made of wind in the last leaves and the water below and the footsteps on the path and the voices of people finding their way home before the dark was complete. The rules were still on the wall. The ledger was still open, but someone had begun to write in it from the other side, and the entries were accumulating, and the balance was moving, slowly and without drama, and without any clean resolution, in the direction of something that more people might recognize as fair. The light went, and the lamps came on, and the canal held a reflection of them in its dark water, broken and shifting and persistent, the way things are that have not yet stopped. If this kind of quiet journey through history is something you find yourself returning to, a subscription keeps these stories coming. And it means a great deal,